Hi, I'm looking at Terry Talks Movies. I'm going to do something a bit different here. I'm going to be talking about naughty 1970s films, but I'm going to try to give them a bit of a social context as well. L.P. Hartley, in his book The Go-Between, said the past is a different country. They do things differently there. And the older I get, the more I realize that the world I grew up in, the world I lived in for a significant chunk of my early life, is a different country. It's a weird place. The rules were different. The laws were different. The social understandings were different. And because this is a movie channel, I realized that the way we view movies is different as well. That was one of the starting points of this particular video. The other one is a book of essays by one of my favorite essayists of the 20th century, Kenneth Tynan, The Sound of Two Hands Clapping. And there is one essay in this which is a little bit confronting for the 1960s. I'm not going to read out the title because Auntie YouTube will get the vapors, but there is the title of the essay itself, which I hope will focus. And in this essay, Tynan delivers an interesting and thoughtful idea, cutting it down to the too long did not read. His premise, and he was a kinky guy, he was, I'm not going to kink shame anybody, but he was into unusual sexual practices that were consensual but were slightly unusual.
Whip crack away, whip crack away, whip crack away.
His argument is that if a work of fiction, and I'm including movies in this, if a work of fiction can make you feel sad, the way Theo Kretschmer-Schuldorff's speech at the end of The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp makes me incredibly sad, or the ending of Tokyo Story makes me sad and brings tears to my eyes. It elicits an emotional response in me. Or if a movie can make you incredibly happy, the way Phoenix Buchanan's song and dance number at the end of Paddington 2 makes me always incredibly happy. Or if a work of fiction, including a movie, can scare you, the way a lot of the things that Art the Clown does in the Terrifier movies scares the shit out of a lot of people. Or the way the shower scene in Psycho plays out scares a lot of people. I saw it in the cinema in the 1970s, nearly 20 years after it came out, and it scared me then. So all of these movies and all these works of fiction can elicit an emotional and physiological response in people. Why is it then not okay for a work of fiction, be it a book, a picture, a story, or a movie? Why is it not okay for them to elicit an arousal response in human beings? And that then brings me to Tynan's premise, which is that people are very prudish, even when they say they support getting rid of censorship. They're very prudish because underlying that is a disapproval of self-pleasure. Let's put it that way. Bringing that into a historical context for my life, and I'm not going to talk about anything I did or did not do. In 1971, censorship in Australia loosened a lot. We still didn't have X-rated movies, but censorship loosened a hell of a lot when the Minister for Customs and Excise, a guy called Don Chipp, who later left the Liberal Party and started his own political party, the Australian Democrats, changed the laws regarding the censorship of movies. He created a new rating system. There was R-rated for movies that you can only get into if you're over 18, though I did see a lot of them between the ages of 15 and 18. There was G, which was general exhibition. Anybody could go and see it. NRC, not recommended for children. There was the M rating, where they suggested you be 15 years or older to see it. And there was the R rating, which would allow a lot of films, particularly films like the first movie from America that got an R rating was McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Robert Altman's movie. The first movie of any kind to get an R rating was an English sex comedy starring Hul Bennett called Percy, about the first Savoy transplant in history. The first Australian movie to get an R rating was The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie, directed by Bruce Beresford, starring Barry Crocker and Barry Humphries. As that occurred, suddenly people found out that people wanted to see these movies, not just men. There were women going to see these movies as well. But people wanted to see movies with a real lack of censorship in them. There were some kind of sly outliers, like there was a movie called Helga, which was a sex education film which had a childbirth on the screen and had a lot of nudity, which was framed in a sexual health and understanding reproduction context. It was a movie from 1968, made in Scandinavia. I think it's Swedish. Might be wrong, but I'll put up here whether I'm wrong. But that one played for years and years in Australia, not because people wanted to know about reproductive health, but because people wanted to see bits and pieces. Now, before the R rating came out, it was very hard to find the good stuff. It was very hard to find pictures of unclad human beings. Of course, were you gay or were you a woman who liked muscle men, you could get men's health magazines with lots of pictures of muscly guys in them. You could watch a Steve Reeves movie, as Frankenfurter tells us in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. You had some options, but if you were heterosexual, your options were pretty much this: Man Magazine and Man Junior, because they had naked women in them, not like full frontal, but they had breasts, very stylish and done, very artistically photographed. And that was the way that people got these things. And I have a fairly reasonable collection of Man magazines, as you can see. They're one of the things I collect. And my friend Trevor keeps telling me anytime he finds new ones, whether I want them or not. So the collection slowly but steadily increases. I'm not going to show you any of the pictures in these, but they are very tasteful 1950s and 1960s nude studies of people. But then R rating comes along and censorship ends for Australia up to a certain point. It took a number of decades later before X-rated material could be found. But then it could only be found in places in Australia that weren't states, in the territories. The Australian Capital Territory around Canberra, the nation's capital, and the Northern Territory both had the ability to distribute X-rated material. Doesn't mean you couldn't get them. It just means that it was a little more dicey to get them. And there were bookshops in Melbourne that had some X-rated material, and every now and then they get raided by the cops. The cops would take away the offending material, and 3 weeks later it would appear again as if by magic. So I thought I'd do a little bit of a show and tell of spicy 1970s movies that were quite popular here in Australia. A lot of these were distributed on physical media by Umbrella Entertainment. So thumbs up to Umbrella Entertainment, which is now being rebranded as just Umbrella. And it looks like they're going ahead gangbusters with showing transgressive material and distributing it in Australia on physical media still. So all credit to them. By the way, their streaming channel Broly, broly.com.au, that's Broly with an IE, is really doing great at the moment. It's a streaming service that's only available in Australia, but they're showing almost every episode of an Australian TV series called Number 96 from the 1970s, which had nudity in it. It was breakthrough as far as LGBTQIA plus representation was concerned. I've talked about it before on the channel. But Broly is going gangbusters because tons and tons of people are just watching episode after episode, and there are hundreds of them, of Number 96 on that platform. But Umbrella distributed a lot of this stuff on physical media. I like fake documentaries. I like those kind of naughty 1970s documentaries, Mondo-type films, where the documentaries were not always entirely accurate, but they were designed to show titillating material to a discerning audience. And one of the earliest things Umbrella put out many moons ago was a double feature, Australia After Dark, a very interesting little documentary produced and directed by John D. Lamond, and the ABC of Love and Sex Australia Style. There it is there. Both of them by John D. Lamond. They're basically Mondo movies. It's in the man's name. They show the edgiest stuff and the kinkiest stuff in Australia in the early 1970s. They play well as documentaries now, even if they are inaccurate, because they show places and people from that era who were on the forefront of exploring human relations, let's say. Now, can I show you the back of this? Yep, because they put little dots over the busty substances.
Busty substances?
I don't know if Umbrella's still got this on their website. Let me check for you because I'm curious to know whether it's still for sale on Umbrella's website. Go get a drink or go to the toilet. I'll be back in a moment. Okay, I've done my research. This one's not for sale on the Umbrella website anymore, but if you go to Brolly, it's there on the Brolly website for people in Australia to stream. So thumbs up to Umbrella for that. So that's the first thing I've got to show you. These ones are such great fun, and they are very much of their time. Australia After Dark's in 4:3 aspect ratio, but the ABC of Love and Sex Australia style is in 16:9. But there were a lot of other things that were shown in Australia. There was a really interesting one, a Danish titillating movie called Dagmar's Hot Pants, which had the virtue of having an Oscar-nominated actor in its cast, a guy called Robert Strauss, who was nominated in 1953-54 for a Best Supporting Actor in Stalag 17 with William Holden, and whose career went downhill because apparently he was a bit of an asshole. But Dagmar's Hot Pants played everywhere. In fact, there were weird things like there were movies up in the country. I went up in the country a few times in the 70s. And community halls would show movies because there were no cinemas nearby. So once a week, the community hall would get some films in and show them. Usually there are things like Skippy and the Intruders, or maybe if they were lucky, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. But I was up in the Tuggerah Lakes area in the 70s. One of the community halls was showing Dagmar's Hot Pants. And apparently they did really well showing that movie to an audience in a community hall up in the Lakes area. But anyway, leaving that aside, Alvin Purple, Australian sex comedy starring Graham Blundell. I've talked about it on the channel before. A lot of fun, very silly, lots of titillating nudity, very funny, witty script, good actors in it. And its sequel, of course, Alvin Rides Again, which is less so. These did incredibly well. I remember seeing it at the Roxy Cinema in Parramatta. Big old Art Deco cinema, which is the only time I've ever been to the Roxy. And they're still arguing about how to renovate it to this very day. But it did very well at the Roxy in the late 70s, 5 years after it first came out. And then there were films, imports again from usually Denmark or Sweden and places like that. This one's Danish as well. And it was a part of a series. There was Bedroom Mazurka, there was Bedroom Dentist. There are a whole bunch of other films that were made in Denmark for an audience. They got increasingly, as the 1970s progressed, more blatant, let's say, in the showing of people being friendly with one another. But Bedroom Mazurka played for a lot of years here in Australia until the Prince wore out, basically. Incredibly popular film. Had some nudity. It was a bit fun. Dubbing wasn't always great, but they somehow managed. And this one played incredibly well. They must have made a fortune on this film, renting it out and showing it in various suburban cinemas and also drive-ins and country cinemas and community halls, all that stuff. This one did incredibly well as well. I'm fairly sure at some stage it would have done a double feature with Bedroom Mazurka. But it's a cut-down version of an American adult film called The Case of the Smiling Stiffs, starring Fred Lincoln. It's about an unusual form of vampirism, let's just put it that way. And totally silly, totally over the top, incredibly amateurish. But it did gangbuster business here in Australia because people wanted to watch those kind of movies. And I remember seeing the films and there were couples in there, not just guys, but couples in there. And the women didn't look like they were being dragged to those cinemas. They wanted to see naughty cinema stuff. They wanted the titillating stuff, which is where Jules Jakin comes in. Emmanuelle did incredibly well with couples. Beautifully shot all across the world, mostly in Thailand, based on the real Emmanuelle Arsan, who was actually a diplomat's wife, a Thai-born diplomat's wife, who worked under a pseudonym. And in fact, the original Emmanuelle, the woman who wrote the novel in 1959, and upon whom the 1974 movie was based, is one of the actresses in a Steve McQueen movie, The Sand Pebbles. And she also turned up as an actress in one episode of The Big Valley on television before she decided that writing erotic novels was definitely her jam. But Emmanuelle did incredibly well with Sylvia Christel, Alain Cuny's in there as well, who was in Fellini's La Dolce Vita. So, they've got quality actors in here. Can I show you the back of this? Yes, I can. And there's an unusual picture of Paul Newman is used to great effect in this movie. If you know, you know. Again, these ones are Umbrella Entertainment releases. And then, of course, there was Francois Jacopetti's Emmanuelle 2. And there was a third one, Goodbye Emmanuelle, that I don't have a copy of. But they were incredibly popular films because they were artistic. They were beautiful. They were languidly shot. The locations were terrific. The unclad people were lovely. Not just the women. There were some unclad men as well, though not quite to the extent that there were unclad women. But the Emmanuelle movies did gangbuster business among couples, not just individual guys wearing unseasonable raincoats. And there were other American imports. There was a cut-down version of this film, which is quite sweet. It's a musical based on Lewis Carroll, the Christine de Bell Alice in Wonderland, which is a fairly good musical for its money, even though it does have a lot of adult material. And there were a couple of scenes of graphic content cut from the Australian version that came out in the cinemas. This is the uncut version because that's my preferred option. But the song and dance numbers are kind of fun in this. They're sweet and charming. And Kristen Bell makes a very interesting and charming Alice. Can I show the back of this? Yeah, I can. So there's the back of it. And I like it. It's I like that combination of raunchiness and whimsical sweetness. There's something about it that works. And it came from that era in the 1970s where people were actually trying to make adult films that had stories and humor and acting and things like that, which are no longer the case because these days nobody watches an adult movie for more than about 2 or 3 minutes. Then we go back to John de la Monde and 2 movies I've talked about before. One of them is by John de la Monde, the other one's by Tony Patterson. Felicity, which was Australia's version of Emmanuelle, starring Gloria Annan, shot in Australia and also in Hong Kong. Beautifully done, very tasteful and lovely, soft focus where appropriate, that kind of thing. And Centrespread, which was a kind of science fictional nudie film in some ways, which gets me on the other subject too, nudist films. Nudist films were incredibly popular, as well as second features. I remember going to the Hoytstown Cinema in Sydney in the 1970s to watch one movie, and they put on a short nudist film before it without telling anybody. An English one called Pussycat's Paradise, which is kind of fun. It's one of those ones where you get a prudish woman who is kind of snookered in to go to a nudist camp and then emerges unclad going, I feel so free. That kind of stuff. All those movies did incredibly well, though it was a little hard to get prints of them here in Australia. But just to finalise on these things, they were very much a product of their time. But they were a liberation. They were breaking down those barriers of censorship and the imposed rules that mostly religious people imposed upon the rest of society. Erotica has always had an audience, and it always will have an audience. It's just, in these days, it's just a matter of whether everything that goes on in those products is consensual or not. And there are also people who, because of economic circumstances, are pushed into either OnlyFans or into making adult material when they don't really want to. I think there's a definite line to draw there, and it's a societal question we've got to keep addressing. There's also the problems with younger people accessing this material. When I was a kid, you had to go 30 kilometers to find the good stuff, and they wouldn't sell it to you unless you're over 18 or you looked over 18. These days, everybody's got it on their Black Mirror, and that's where the problem lies. But there was that moment when there was a breaking through of censorship to a certain extent in Australia here, and people wanted to see these films and continue to want to see these films. And now they've got a nostalgia about them. And now we can examine them, understanding that the past is a different country and they did things differently then. Nonetheless, this is a part of cinema history. And I don't believe it's a dishonourable part of cinema history. I think it's as valid as a horror movie from the 70s. It's as valid as a very bad musical like Xanadu. These are movies that people wanted to see. They were movies that were being made for a certain audience. And they were, while not as successful as Xanadu, they were successful in their own terms. And people have a nostalgic fondness for them. And rewatching them, most of them, there's a kind of sweetness about them that modern movies of a similar theme no longer have. So that's it this time around. Something a bit different. It's been an itch I needed to scratch for a while. Though that sounds incredibly wrong. But you know what I mean. It's an idea I've had for a while that I wanted to put on video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Let me know which movies of this type you were watching when you were younger and whether you were caught watching them. These movies I watched before the VHS revolution, so they weren't something that I had to go and rent from a shop. They were something I sat in a dark room with a whole bunch of unusual strangers to watch. But they are, I think, historically important as well. If you want to support the channel, you can become a channel member or you can become a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Next up, we've got Science Fiction Saturday, and we're doing 2 real bangers from the 1980s on Science Fiction Saturday this week. So until all of that stuff happens, and hopefully until the weather warms up, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some naughty movies without fear, and I'll catch you next time.